a boy was left at his door with a note. "This is your son. Don't let him die." What if a life shut away from the world was suddenly broken open by a responsibility it never asked for? What happens when a man, who has built his walls so high that not even the winter wind could find a crack, discovers a new world shivering on his doorstep? In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Montana territories, where the mountains scraped the sky and the silence was a language of its own, some men sought fortune, others freedom. Lucian Blackwood sought only oblivion. His small forge and cabin were tucked into a fold of the valley, a place the sun touched last and the snows clung to longest, as if the land itself respected his wish to be forgotten. He was a man made of the same hard materials he worked, iron and stone and regret, his heart banked like the coals of his forge, holding a heat that no longer served to warm anything but its own embers. The world had taken everything from him once, a lifetime ago, and he had made a solemn vow to never offer it a second chance. But the world does not always ask for permission. It arrived on a night when the cold was a physical thing, a predator that stalked the valley, its breath a crystalline frost that shattered the air. It came not as a storm or a shadow, but as a sound, a thin, desperate cry nearly swallowed by the howl of the wind. Lucian, drawn from a shallow, dreamless sleep, first dismissed it as a trick of the gale, a mountain cat's wail. But it came again, sharper this time, a note of pure human misery that pierced the thick log walls of his cabin and the even thicker walls around his soul. He took his rifle, his movements stiff and wary, and unbarred the heavy door. The wind tore at him, a furious, icy assault, and there, in a roughly made wicker basket set upon the snow-dusted planks of his porch, was the source of the sound. It was a baby, no more than a few months old, wrapped in a thin wool blanket that was already stiff with ice. The child's face was a mottled purple from the cold, its cries weak, exhausted things. Lucian's breath caught in his chest, a shard of ice. His gaze swept the darkness, searching for a retreating figure, a horse, anything. There was only the swirling snow and the monolithic indifference of the mountains. He saw the note then, pinned to the blanket, a small white square fluttering madly in the wind. His calloused fingers, clumsy with the cold and a sudden violent tremor, worked it free. The pencil script was frantic, spidery. "This is your son. His name is Leo. Don't let him die." The words were not a plea. They were a command, a final, desperate act of faith placed at the feet of a man who had none left. Lucian looked down at the child, at the tiny clenched fists and the impossibly small face, and the frozen landscape of his past cracked open. He remembered a face, a girl named Mary from the town downriver, a brief, shared warmth one summer that felt like another man's life. He had never known. He had never asked. The wind howled a lament, but Lucian no longer heard it. He heard only the fading cry of the child and the stark, brutal finality of the note's last three words. "Don't let him die." With a groan that seemed to be pulled from the very bedrock of his soul, Lucian scooped the basket into his arms, turned his back on the storm, and brought the world inside. The first hour was a frantic, clumsy ballet of survival. Lucian, a man whose hands were accustomed to the unforgiving heft of a hammer and the blistering heat of the forge, found himself fumbling with the delicate reality of a child. He stripped away the frozen blanket, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs as he saw the chilling pallor of the infant's skin. He filled a basin with warm water from the stove, his movements jerky and uncertain, testing it again and again with his elbow as he'd seen women do. A memory dredged from a life he kept buried. The baby, Leo, was terrifyingly quiet now, his small body limp with cold. Lucian submerged him gently, whispering words he didn't know he possessed. Rough guttural sounds of reassurance meant as much for himself as for the boy. "It's all right. You're safe now. You're warm." The words felt foreign on his tongue, brittle as frost. He worked with a singular focus, the rest of the world falling away. The forge outside could go cold. The mountains could crumble. All that mattered was the fragile life in his hands. He rubbed the boy's limbs, stimulating circulation, watching with an almost prayerful intensity for a sign, a flicker. And then it came. A small, shuddering gasp, a weak cry that grew in strength, turning into a full-throated wail of protest and life. Relief washed over Lucian so powerfully his knees felt weak. He wrapped the boy in the softest wool shirt he owned, the fabric absurdly large, and held him against the warmth of his own chest. The baby's cries slowly subsided into soft, hiccuping breaths, his small head nestled under Lucian's chin. The man stood there in the center of his small, solitary cabin, a fortress that had just been breached, holding a son he never knew he had. The note lay on the table, a stark white testament to the night's events. "This is your son. Mary." It had to be Mary. He remembered her clear, hopeful eyes, a stark contrast to the weary cynicism in his own. He remembered the kindness she had shown him, a blacksmith with a past he never spoke of, a man the town tolerated but never embraced. She had seen something else in him, or perhaps had simply refused to see the darkness. And now, she was gone. The desperation in that note spoke of a finality he understood all too well. She must have known she wouldn't survive, and her last act on earth was to entrust her child to him. A fool's hope, she might have thought, but it was the only hope she had. He looked down at the sleeping child, the tiny chest rising and falling in a steady, trusting rhythm. A wave of something fierce and terrifyingly protective surged through him. It was an emotion he thought had died in him long ago, buried under years of grief and isolation. Now it was resurrected, raw and potent. He was a father. The word was a foreign country, a place he never expected to visit again. The path ahead was a complete unknown, a wilderness more daunting than the one outside his door. He had no idea how to raise a child, how to nurture a life when his own had been so deliberately barren. But as he held the small, warm weight against his chest, one thing became terrifyingly clear. He would not fail. He would not let this boy die. He had been given a command, and by God, he would obey it. Months bled into one another, marked by the changing moods of the mountains and the steady growth of the boy. The valley thawed, bloomed, and braced itself for winter once more. Lucian's life, once a predictable, solitary rhythm of fire and iron, was now chaotic, unpredictable, and anchored by the needs of another. His hands, still calloused from the forge, learned the gentle art of changing swaddling, of mixing milk and mush, of testing for fevers with the back of his hand. He spoke more in those months than he had in the previous 5 years, his voice a low rumble as he explained the world to Leo, narrating the dance of the flames in the forge, the shape of the clouds, the names of the birds that nested in the eaves of his cabin. Leo, in turn, was a healthy, thriving child. He learned to smile, a gummy, whole-faced expression that could shatter Lucian's gruff exterior in an instant. He learned to crawl, his small journeys across the rough-hewn floor a constant source of both terror and pride for his father. The cabin, once a sterile monument to solitude, was now cluttered with the beautiful mess of a child's life. A carved wooden bird with one slightly crooked wing, a soft rabbit pelt for the boy to sleep on, a collection of smooth river stones. Lucian was not the same man. The change was subtle to an outsider, but profound to him. The hard lines around his eyes had softened, and the ever-present tension in his shoulders had eased. He was still a man of few words, still wary of the world beyond his small patch of land. But the core of him, the banked fire, was now burning for a purpose. It was this new, fragile world that the blizzard sought to destroy. It came without warning, a monstrous white wave rolling down from the northern peaks. It was no ordinary storm. It was a hungry, malevolent thing, a physical manifestation of nature's rage. The wind screamed like a banshee, tearing at the cabin, and the snow fell so thick and fast it erased the world, leaving only a swirling vortex of white. Lucian secured the cabin, his movements efficient and practiced. He checked the shutters, stuffed rags into the cracks around the door, and piled more wood by the hearth. Leo, sensing the tension, was fussy and quiet, his wide eyes fixed on his father. The storm raged for 2 days, imprisoning them in a world of howling wind and cold. On the third morning, the wind died down to a low, mournful moan, but the snow continued to fall, a silent, relentless siege. It was in this strange, muffled quiet that Lucian heard it. A sound, not a cry, but a heavy rhythmic thudding against the side of the cabin. Thud, thud, thud. And then silence. His first thought was a bear, driven from its den by the storm. He grabbed his rifle, his heart pounding, and moved towards the door. He listened, pressing his ear against the cold wood. Nothing. He slowly, carefully lifted the bar and cracked the door open a few inches. An avalanche of snow fell inward, and with it, a shape. It was a person, a woman, who tumbled into the cabin, a heap of snow-caked wool and desperation. She lay face down on the floor, unmoving. Lucian knelt, rolling her over gently. Her face was blue with cold, her lips cracked and pale. She was young, her features drawn and haggard with exhaustion and fear. Her breath was a shallow, almost imperceptible flutter. He could see she was at the very edge of her life. For a moment, the old Lucian, the one who wanted no part of the world's troubles, hesitated. But then he looked at Leo, who was watching from his cradle with wide, curious eyes. He looked at the unconscious woman on his floor, and he knew he couldn't close the door. He couldn't turn his back. He had brought one life in from the cold. He would not abandon another to it. He gathered her into his arms, surprised by how light she was, and carried her to the hearth, beginning the desperate work of chasing death away for the second time. The woman's name was Selene. It took her the better part of a day to utter it, her voice a raw, broken whisper. She drifted in and out of consciousness, caught in a fevered haze, muttering fragmented words about a journey, about running, about being cast out. Lucian worked methodically, forcing warm broth between her chapped lips, piling blankets on her, tending to the frostbite that had blackened the tips of her fingers. He did it all with a detached efficiency, a part of him still resisting this intrusion, this new complication. He was a blacksmith and a father. He was not a nursemaid to a stranger. Yet he could not stop. Every time he looked at her, so perilously close to the same fate that had almost claimed his son, the same protective instinct now honed by months of fatherhood, took over. When her fever finally broke, she awoke with a clarity that was sharp with fear. Her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of green, darted around the small cabin, taking in the rustic furnishings, the sleeping child in the cradle, and finally, the large, silent man watching her from his chair by the fire. She tried to sit up, a gasp of pain escaping her lips. "Easy," Lucian rumbled, his voice gruff. "You've been through a trial." She sank back down, her gaze wary, guarded. "Where am I? Who are you?" "You're at my forge. Name's Lucian." "You collapsed outside." His answers were clipped, offering no more than the barest facts. He was not a man for pleasantries. He watched as she absorbed this. her expression shifting from fear to a deep, profound weariness. "The storm," she whispered. "I thought." "It nearly took you," he finished for her. "You're lucky I heard you." A tense silence fell between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of the sleeping Leo. It was a silence of two people who had been broken by the world in different ways. Two solitary souls, suddenly and uncomfortably thrust into each other's orbit. An alliance was formed in that silence, unspoken and unasked for, built on the simple, brutal foundation of necessity. She needed shelter to survive, and he, though he was loath to admit it, needed help. Raising a child alone in this wilderness was a monumental task, and the arrival of this woman, capable and quiet, felt like an answer to a prayer he'd never dared to make. The next few days established a new, cautious rhythm in the cabin. Selene, though still weak, insisted on earning her keep. She had a quiet competence that impressed Lucian. She mended their clothes with neat, precise stitches. Her hands, though raw, surprisingly deft. She took over the cooking, transforming his simple rations into savory, nourishing stews that filled the small space with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Most importantly, she was gentle with Leo. She had a natural, easy way with the boy, her voice soft as she sang him wordless lullabies, her touch tender as she bathed him. Lucian would watch them from the corner of his eye as he worked on his tools, a strange feeling twisting in his gut. It was a feeling dangerously close to peace. Their conversations were sparse, functional things. "The wood is low. I need more flour from the store. The boy has a tooth coming in." Yet, in the spaces between the words, something else was being built. It was built in the way she would have a hot cup of coffee waiting for him when he came in from the forge, his hands aching with cold. It was built in the way he took her worn-out boots and meticulously resoled them with fresh leather, making them stronger than they had ever been. It was built in the shared glances over the top of Leo's head, a silent acknowledgement of a sweet or funny moment. Trust was not given, but earned, one small, quiet act at a time. He was a fortress, and she was a refugee. And together, they were slowly, tentatively, building something that felt a little like home. The deep snows of the long winter held them in a state of suspended reality, an isolated world of three. In this forced intimacy, the walls between Lucian and Selene began to erode, not in a sudden collapse, but in a slow, granular wearing away. The quiet of the cabin was no longer a tense, watchful thing, but a comfortable silence, filled with the domestic sounds of a life being lived. The rhythmic clink of Selene's knitting needles, the soft gurgles of Leo playing on his rabbit pelt, the steady scratch of Lucian's knife as he carved another animal for the boy. These were the sounds of their new language, a vocabulary of shared existence. Selene's physical strength returned, and with it, a measure of her spirit. The haunted, hunted look in her eyes was gradually replaced by a quiet resilience. Lucian saw it in the determined set of her jaw as she kneaded bread, in the small, genuine smiles that graced her lips when Leo giggled. He began to see not just the refugee he had rescued, but the woman she was, proud, compassionate, and possessed of an inner strength that rivaled the hardiest oak. He found himself wanting to know her story, not out of idle curiosity, but from a genuine, burgeoning need to understand the path that had led her, half frozen, to his door. One evening, as a gentle snow fell outside, blanketing the world in a fresh layer of peace, the truth finally emerged. They sat by the fire, Leo asleep in his cradle, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the log walls. "My husband died a year ago," Selene began, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the flames. "His family, They never approved of me. I was a farmer's daughter. They were merchants. They saw me as beneath them. She spoke of how, after her husband's death, his parents had systematically stripped her of everything: her home, her savings, her dignity. They had cast her out with nothing but the clothes on her back, telling her she was no longer their concern. I was heading west, she said, a tremor in her voice. To Oregon. I heard there was work, a new start. I just didn't account for the storm. Lucian listened, his usual stony expression unreadable, but his hands were clenched into tight fists on his knees. He knew the casual cruelty of small-town judgment, the way people could be discarded like so much refuse. He felt a hot, protective anger rise in him, an anger on her behalf that surprised him with its intensity. The urge to speak, to offer some comfort, was a physical weight in his chest, but words of comfort had long been strangers to him. Instead, he simply said, "They were fools." It was not much, but coming from him, the words were a profound declaration. They meant, "I see you, I understand. You are not worthless." A single tear traced a path down Selene's cheek, shimmering in the firelight. She did not wipe it away. "And you, Lucian?" she asked, her voice gentle. "What brought you to this valley?" For a long moment, he said nothing. He stared into the fire, into a past he kept locked away. But looking at her, at the quiet empathy in her eyes, he felt a crack appear in the vault. "My wife," he said, the words rough, as if torn from his throat. "And my daughter. They died, fever, 10 years ago." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The raw grief was still there, a living thing in the timbre of his voice. Selene reached out then, her hand tentatively covering his. His first instinct was to pull away, to retreat back into the safety of his shell. But he didn't. He let her hand rest on his, a small point of warmth against his calloused skin. It was not a gesture of pity, but of shared understanding. Two people, hollowed out by loss, finding a flicker of solace in each other's presence. In that moment, the needs-based alliance shifted into something deeper, something more fragile and more powerful. They were no longer just a man, a woman, and a child. They were a constellation, 3 solitary points of light finding their shape in the darkness, drawn together by the invisible gravity of a shared future. As the grip of winter loosened and the valley began to breathe again, the fragile peace of the cabin was put to the test. Lucian had to make trips into the nearby town of Clearwater for supplies, a journey he now undertook with a sense of dread. Before, he was just the town recluse, the surly blacksmith who kept to himself. His solitude was his armour. But now he had something to protect. The town, as all small towns do, noticed the change. They saw the new items in his wagon: sacks of finer flour, bolts of soft cloth, a small tin of sweets. Whispers began to follow him like his own shadow. The gossip started in the mercantile, fueled by the sharp eyes and sharper tongue of Beatrice Hemlock, the proprietor's wife. "See that?" she'd murmur to her customers. "Lucian Blackwood, buying baby things. And ladies' things too. And him, unmarried." The speculation grew wilder with each retelling. Some said he'd bought a mail-order bride. Others whispered he'd stolen a child. The story of the woman who had stumbled into town just before the great blizzard, ragged and desperate, was resurrected and connected to him. The narrative that formed was ugly and judgmental. Lucian, the hermit, was now Lucian, the sinner, living with a fallen woman and a bastard child up in his isolated hollow. He felt their stares like physical blows. The suspicion in their eyes, the way they'd pull their children a little closer when he passed. He ignored it, his face a mask of stone, but their judgment coiled in his stomach like a cold snake. Selene felt it too, though she never left the cabin. She felt it in the way Lucian was quieter, more grim after a trip to town. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was perpetually tight. She knew they were living on borrowed time, in a bubble that was bound to burst. "What do they say, Lucian?" she asked one evening, her voice steady. He was sharpening an axe, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel filling the silence. He didn't look up. "Nothing that matters." "It matters if it brings trouble to this door," she countered, her gaze unwavering. He finally stopped, setting the stone down. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the fear he tried so hard to conceal. It wasn't fear for himself, it was fear for her and for Leo. "This is a good place," he said, his voice low, quiet, safe. It was the closest he could come to saying what he truly felt. "This place with you, with the boy, is the only home I've known in a decade. I won't let them poison it." Their life continued, a quiet rebellion against the world's judgment. They found their joy not in the town's acceptance, but within the four walls of the cabin. They found it in Leo taking his first wobbly steps, his small hands clutching their fingers for support. They found it in the garden Selene planted, a defiant patch of green against the wild landscape, promising potatoes and beans and squash. They found it in the evenings, when Lucian would tell Leo stories, not from books, but from his own imagination. Tales of brave animals and magical mountains, his deep voice a gentle rumble. The love between them was unspoken, but it was as real and tangible as the roof over their heads. It was in every shared task, every quiet meal, every protective glance. It was a love forged not in passion and poetry, but in the crucible of shared hardship and mutual respect. It was strong, resilient, and utterly unprepared for the storm that was gathering just beyond the horizon, a storm far more dangerous than any winter blizzard. It was a storm of flesh and blood, of pride and greed, and it was heading directly for them. The harbinger of the storm arrived in Clearwater, on the back of a fine blood bay gelding. He was a man who wore his wealth and importance like a suit of armour. His name was Alistair Sterling, and he radiated an aura of cold, uncompromising authority that made the townsfolk both resentful and eager to please. He was a cattle baron from the east, a man used to getting what he wanted, and he had come to the valley looking for his grandson. He began his inquiries at the mercantile, his questions sharp and precise. He was looking for information about his daughter, Mary, a young woman, fair-haired, who had run away from home nearly a year ago. Beatrice Hemlock, sensing an opportunity to be at the centre of a great drama, was all too willing to talk. She told him of the whispers, of the reclusive blacksmith, Lucian Blackwood, and the child he was raising. She spoke of the strange woman who now lived with him. Sterling's face, already a mask of grim displeasure, tightened into something truly menacing. He had disowned his daughter for shaming him, for consorting with a low-born tradesman. He had considered her dead to him. But a grandson, a Sterling, that was different. That was a bloodline, a legacy. He could not allow a piece of his dynasty to be raised in squalor by a grimy blacksmith and his harlot. His pride demanded he reclaim what was his. The news of Sterling's arrival travelled up the valley faster than a brush fire. A trapper, passing by Lucian's forge, delivered the warning. "There's a rich man in town, Lucian, asking about a baby, asking about you." A cold dread, sharp and familiar, settled over Lucian. He had known on some level that this day might come. He had hoped the boy's mother had covered her tracks, that she had disappeared so completely that no one would ever come looking. But he had not counted on the relentless pride of a man like Alistair Sterling. That evening, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken fear. Selene watched Lucian as he barred the door, his movements deliberate, final. "He's here for Leo," Lucian stated, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. Selene felt a chill run down her spine, a fear more potent than any she had felt during the blizzard. This was not an impersonal force of nature. This was a man driven by cruelty and possession. "He can't take him," she whispered, her hand instinctively going to the now empty cradle. Leo was asleep in the small room Lucian had built for him, a symbol of the life they had so carefully constructed. "He is your son." "By blood, maybe," Lucian said, his back to her as he stared out the small window into the encroaching dusk. "But not by right. Men like him believe blood is the only thing that matters. They believe they can buy and sell souls." "He is not for sale," Selene said, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she had. She came to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "This is his home. We are his family." Lucian looked at her then, at the fierce, protective fire in her green eyes. He saw his own fear and his own resolve mirrored there. For 10 years, he had run from the world, from connection, from love. He had believed that to be safe, he had to be alone. But now, standing beside this woman, with the sleeping child in the next room, he understood a profound truth. True strength wasn't found in isolation. It was found in having something to stand for, something to fight for. "Let him come," Lucian said, and the words were not a statement of defeat, but a vow. He'll find more than a blacksmith waiting for him. The fortress he had built to keep the world out was now a fortress to protect the world he had built inside. And he would not let it fall. They did not have to wait long. 2 days later, as the morning sun cast long shadows across the valley, 3 riders appeared at the edge of the clearing. Alistair Sterling sat astride his bay gelding, flanked by 2 rough-looking men, whose hands rested near the pistols on their hips. They stopped just short of the cabin, an invading army come to lay siege. Lucian met them on the porch. He stood alone, unarmed, his feet planted wide, as immovable as the mountain behind him. He had told Selene to stay inside with Leo, to lock the door, and not come out no matter what she heard. Sterling dismounted, his expensive leather boots crunching on the gravel. He was a tall man, imposing, with eyes as cold and grey as a winter sky. He surveyed the humble cabin, the smoking forge, and Lucian himself, with an expression of undisguised contempt. "You are Blackwood," Sterling stated, his voice dripping with condescension. "I am," Lucian replied, his own voice a low, steady rumble. "I am Alistair Sterling, the child you are keeping here. He is my grandson." "He is my son," Lucian said simply. The words hung in the air, a quiet, unshakable declaration of fact. Sterling let out a short, humourless laugh. "A biological accident, a consequence of my daughter's poor judgment. It does not make you his father, it makes you an opportunist." He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick leather wallet. "I am a reasonable man. I will compensate you for your trouble. Name your price. $100? 200? It will be enough to set you up somewhere far from here." The insult was as sharp as a slap. Lucian's jaw tightened, but his expression did not change. "He's not for sale." Sterling's face darkened, his veneer of civility cracking. "Do not be a fool, blacksmith. That boy is a Sterling. He will be raised as such, with wealth, education, and position. What can you offer him? The smell of coal smoke and a life of poverty. You are being selfish." "I can offer him a father," Lucian said, his voice gaining an edge of steel. "I can offer him a home where he is loved, not owned. That is more than your money can ever buy." "Love?" Sterling sneered, the word sounding like a profanity on his lips. "You know nothing of love. You, a reclusive brute, living in sin with that cast-off woman." Just then the cabin door creaked open. Selene stood there, her face pale but resolute, a shotgun held firmly in her hands. She was not pointing it, but its presence was a clear statement. You will not speak of him that way, she said, her voice trembling but clear. And you will not speak of me that way. Your daughter ran from your cruelty, Mr. Sterling. She chose this man, however briefly, because he had a kindness in him that you have never known. She trusted him to protect her son from you. We will not fail her. Sterling's face contorted with rage. He looked from Lucian's unyielding stance to Selene's fierce defense. His plan to intimidate and buy his way to victory was failing. You will regret this, he snarled, turning to his men. Take the boy. The two hired men hesitated, exchanging a nervous glance. They had signed on to intimidate a lowly blacksmith, not to engage in a firefight with a desperate man and a woman who looked like she would sooner die than yield. They saw Lucian, who still hadn't moved, who looked as if he was carved from the very rock of the mountain. They saw Selene, her fear eclipsed by a mother's protective fury, and they saw Sterling, whose motives were so clearly rooted in pride, not love. They looked at each other, and then back at Sterling, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, shook their heads. They would not draw on this family. The confrontation was over. Sterling stood there, utterly alone, defeated not by violence, but by the quiet, unbreakable strength of a love he could not comprehend. He stared at them, his face a mask of pure hatred, before turning on his heel, mounting his horse, and riding away without another word, a bitter and diminished man. The sound of the retreating hoofbeats faded into the vast silence of the valley, leaving an emptiness that was heavier than any noise. Lucian and Selene remained where they were for a long moment, frozen in the aftermath, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving them shaky and exhausted. The shotgun in Selene's hands felt impossibly heavy. She lowered it, her arms trembling, and leaned against the doorframe for support. Lucian turned, his eyes finding hers. The stony mask was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability. He saw the terror she had suppressed, the courage she had summoned, and he felt a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to bring him to his knees. Gratitude, admiration, a fierce, protective love that was so immense it felt like it might break him open. He crossed the porch in 2 long strides and simply stood in front of her, his big frame shielding her. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His presence was an anchor, a promise. He slowly reached out and took the shotgun from her hands, setting it carefully aside. Then, his calloused fingers, so accustomed to the unyielding nature of iron, gently cupped her face. His touch was hesitant, almost reverent. "You were afraid," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "I was," she admitted in a whisper, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "But not for myself." His thumb brushed the tear away, his touch incredibly gentle. "I know." The silence that fell between them was no longer tense or cautious. It was profound, filled with everything that had just been proven on that porch. Loyalty, family, love. They had faced the worst the world could throw at them, and they had not broken. They had stood together, a united front against cruelty and greed, and they had won. Inside the cabin, a small cry broke the stillness. Leia was awake. The sound was a powerful reminder of what they had been fighting for, the center of their small universe. Selene moved to go to him, but Lucian's hand on her arm stopped her. "Wait," he said. He looked deep into her eyes, and she saw the last of his walls crumbling, the final defenses of the fortress of his heart being willingly dismantled. "Selene," he began, the name a prayer on his lips. "What I have here, what we have here, I haven't had a home in 10 years, not until you." The confession was simple, stark, and held the weight of a decade of loneliness. It was the most he had ever said, and it was everything. "I thought this cabin was my shelter," he continued, his voice low and earnest. But I was wrong. It was just a place to hide. Home. Home is you. It's the boy. It's this life we've made. Selene's heart ached with a sweet, painful joy. She raised her hand and placed it over his, pressing his palm against her cheek. "I was running, Lucian," she said, her own voice thick with unshed tears. "I was running from a life where I didn't belong. I was just looking for a place to rest. But I found more. I found a place to stay. This is my home too." There, on the porch of the small cabin, with the morning sun warming their faces and the cry of their son calling to them, their found family was no longer a tentative arrangement. It was a covenant, sealed not with vows or rings, but with a shared trial by fire and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that they belonged to each other. He leaned in, and she met him halfway, their lips meeting in a kiss that was not about passion, but about promise. It was a kiss of profound relief, of deep, soulful recognition, and of a future that had finally blessedly begun. The seasons turned, each one leaving its mark on the valley and on the family that called it home. The apple orchard they had dreamed of became a reality, a neat grid of young saplings that promised future harvests. The cabin grew, with Lucian adding a new room, his hammer blows ringing with the purpose of a man building for a future he believed in. Leo, no longer a baby, became a thoughtful, kind-hearted boy who adored his little sister, a girl born 2 summers after the confrontation, a bright, cheerful child with her mother's green eyes and her father's steady gaze. They named her Hope. The family of 4 became the quiet, unshakable heart of the Hollow. The town of Clearwater had long since accepted the Blackwood family. Lucian's skill as a blacksmith, his unwavering integrity, and the simple, undeniable decency of his family had won over even the most stubborn skeptics. Their homestead became a symbol of resilience in the valley, a testament to the fact that a good life could be built from the most unlikely of beginnings. People now came to Lucian not just for his ironwork, but for his quiet wisdom. He had become a pillar of the community he once shunned. On a warm summer evening, 5 years after Alistair Sterling had ridden away in defeat, Lucian, Selene, and their 2 children sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the mountains. Leo sat beside his father, painstakingly carving his own small wooden bird, while Hope babbled happily in Selena's lap. A profound sense of peace filled Lucian, so deep and complete it felt like a part of his very soul. He looked at Selene, her face illuminated in the golden light, and her smile was all the answer he would ever need. He reached for her hand, their fingers lacing together. This was it. This was everything. The lonely, broken man was gone, replaced by a husband and a father whose heart was as full as the valley was wide. He had been given a command, "Don't let him die." He had not only obeyed it, he had transformed it. He had built a life, a legacy, and a love that would endure long after the fires of his forge had grown cold. What truly defines a family? Is it the blood that runs through our veins, or is it something quieter, something stronger, forged in the crucible of shared adversity? For Lucian, Selene, and Leo, the answer was written in the neat rows of a garden, in the sturdy walls of a home, and in the comfortable silence between 2 people who know each other's souls. Their story is a powerful reminder that the greatest legacies are not chiseled in stone or measured in gold. They are the love we cultivate and the hope we nurture in the lives of others. What do you think? Is family defined by blood or by bond? Let us know in the comments. If their journey touched your heart, please like and subscribe for more tales of resilience, redemption, and the enduring power of the human heart. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next story.